Dr. Baradei, thank you very much for taking the time to sit with us. Let's start by talking a little bit about your background and your roots. If you could tell us a bit about, where you were born and your education, that would be great.
Well, Yasmin, let me first say it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to have this discussion with you and to, through your magazine, to be able to, connect with the young people and people who are interested in getting Egypt to move into a modern and moderate society. My background is not much different from many Egyptians. I grew up in Cairo. I went to an Egyptian school. I went to the law school here. Then I joined the Foreign Service. Wasn't really, I served in New York and Geneva, basically with the UN. I wanted a more broader horizon, so I got an opportunity to join the United Nations as Director of International Law Research in 1980, and that's when I left the Foreign Service, and I was teaching law. I was, for a number of years. Then I joined the agency as the representative at the UN in New York, then back to Vienna as a legal advisor, then an assistant director general of the agency, and then as a director general since 1997 for 12 years. In the meantime, of course, I got a doctorate degree in international law from New York University, and that was also a great asset, frankly, because, as you know, the education in Egypt is based on rote learning, and I learned how to think and the value of education in the sense of how to be able to get a problem and try to find a solution. And through discipline, through using all the tools available to you, through being open to new ideas. And I think I always believe that was an important milestone in my life, is to be exposed to a free society, to be able to think freely, to be able to use and learn all the tools available to how to cope, and that I think helped me a lot throughout my career.
And did this education, was that a turning point in where you decided your career wanted to go?
I think so. Again, one of my mentors, Tom Frank, who was a professor at NYU, he was really a great man. He passed away last year, and he always focused on the big picture, and not on the parochial approach to resolving issues. And that's something I think I learned from him, and that's something I think was it in me. Is you can't really look at things, from a very narrow perspective, from a very blinker perspective, but you need to take a broad picture. And it is a broad picture which led me to understand that we are now living in a world where you cannot resolve any issue unless you take a broad picture. Whether you talk about HIV/AIDS, where I am now part of the high-level commission, in fact, to combat AIDS, UN, you need us, or arms control, or weapons of mass destruction, or communicable diseases, or climate change. There is none of these, of these problems or any other where we can find a solution unless we work together. So that got me attracted to work from an international perspective, meaning try to preach, so to speak, that we are one human family, and if we need to move forward, we need to move forward based on cooperation and not confrontation, and not, it is not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win situation. Either we are all going to win or we are going to lose together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about some of these issues that you're involved with. Of all the different issues, which are closest to your heart? Which are you most passionate about right now?
I think there are two issues, Yasmin, are inequities and insecurities, global inequities and global insecurities. I can tell you, again, numbers which are horrifying. Half our world, 3 billion people, live under $2.50 a day. Wow. There is 1 billion people who go to bed hungry every night, and that's according to the World Food Program. There is 1% of the world population owns 40% of the world asset, and then conversely, 50% of our fellow human beings own 1% of the world assets. So this is not sustainable. And then you talk about war, you talk about violence, you talk about, well, I always said, unless you deal with the root causes, unless you understand where people are coming from. If people are poor, that's usually associated with lack of good governance. That's usually associated with violence, with civil wars, and in areas like in the Middle East, when you have endemic crises, people are tempted to acquire nuclear weapons. So I always said, poverty is the most lethal weapon of mass destruction. The other issue, of course, which is quite linked with that, is insecurity. I mean, we live in a world where you have the nuclear haves, 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, and tell everybody else you cannot touch nuclear weapons because they are not good for you, but they are good for us because they serve as deterrent for our security. And then you have the NATO umbrella when you have 30 privileged countries living under the so-called US umbrella, and the rest are left in the cold, if you like. Well, that's again, is a situation which is not sustainable. So we still live in a world that is marred by double standard, by inequities, and by insecurities. And these are, frankly, the issues, I am focusing the rest of my life on, because I know if we, and as I mentioned, particularly in this globalized world right now, it is absolutely, we will self-destruct unless we change our mindset. And our mindset is to understand that irrespective of our ethnicity, language, color, what have you, we are all the same human family, have the same hopes, same aspirations, and we need to understand that we are each other keeper, and if we don't do that, I see a very gloomy future, Yasmin.
Just to touch on the nuclear debate again for a minute, do you feel that, the West is right, like in the case of Iran, that it is really such a cause of concern, or is it a good alternative energy opportunity for developing nations? I mean, as you said, some privileged countries are allowed to have it, some others aren't. How did you assess this dilemma when you were heading the IAEA?
Okay. Yasmin, we have to make a differentiation between nuclear energy for peaceful uses, for generating electricity, and nuclear energy to develop weapons. I mean, like with any other technology, like with the chemical agent or biological agent, you can use it to have drugs, to deal with, to cure diseases. You can use it as biological weapons. So it depends, the problem, as I think Idley Stevenson said, the problem is not with the atom, it is with our own heart, with what we have inside us. And nuclear energy for development is absolutely key. I mean, there are now 30 countries who are using nuclear energy for electricity. In a place like France, for example, they rely on nuclear energy for 78% of their electricity supply. It's a clean source of energy, it gives you energy independence, it guards you against fluctuation in energy prices. So, and for developing countries, I mean, energy is the key for development. I think we can forget about development unless you have energy. I mean, I saw the other day here that Egypt even having a shortage of electricity, and everybody understands that without energy, you will not have development. And then compare some of the standards we have in OECD countries, for example, the developed countries. They use average 8,600 kilowatt hours per year. In a country like Nigeria, they use like 100 kilowatt hour per year. So the difference is over 150 times more. And no wonder now people started to think seriously, many developing countries, that we need the energy because if we don't have energy, we are at a dead end street. But coming back to Iran, of course, want to use nuclear energy, and they are using nuclear energy now. They built their first power reactor with the Russian assistance at Bushehr. But there are also concern about whether Iran is moving toward, having a nuclear weapon. And that's a very complicated issue, of course. It goes back 50 years, when the West, toppled the first nationally elected government in Tehran, the Mossadegh government. We went then through the hostages in 1979. So there's a huge gap or a huge period of distrust between the US in particular and Iran. Iran, what my belief is, could have maybe thought of developing a nuclear weapon in the mid-80s, when they were engaged in a horrifying war with Iraq, and when Iraq, in fact, was using chemical weapon against them, with the support of the West, with the support of the Arabs, in fact, I should say, against, to contain the so-called the Iranian Revolution. So Iran could have thought of developing a nuclear weapon at that time to protect itself. I think at this stage, Iran is smarter. Iran would want to develop the technology, the know-how, to be able to develop nuclear weapon in a short span of time, say 6 months, a year, 2 years, but not really developing a nuclear weapon. In a way, continue to be kosher, if you like, within the non-proliferation regime. And in that sense, it is not different from Brazil, from Japan, from Germany, who have the technology. So, but there has been, the Iranian situation is really primarily a competition of power between Iran with its ideology and the West, and the US primarily with their different ideologies. And Iran has been painted as Mr. Bush mentioned, axis of evil. Well, that is, again, we have to look at the big picture. Iran is not going to be resolved until the two parties, the US and Iran, sit together on the negotiating table and start building trust. The question of Iran is a question of future intentions. It's not that Iran have a weapon today, but what Iran is going to do in 5, 10 years. And that you cannot treat future intention. All you can do is build trust, and you cannot build trust until you sit together, put all your grievances on the table, and see how you can build confidence building. So I have been saying for a number of years, yes, Iran is a concern. We need to deal with Iran, but the only way to deal with Iran is through meaningful negotiation. Unfortunately, we lost many, many years when during the Bush administration, which the approach was absolutely ideological based, saying you have to completely undress before we start talking to you. That led us nowhere. We finally got Obama, who understood that and reached out to Iran, saying that I'm ready to talk to you on the basis of mutual respect and without precondition. Unfortunately, right now, that was in the middle of the Iranian election and when the things got completely bogged down because of domestic situation. Yeah. And by the time the Iran put their act together, we now have, again, a domestic situation in the US, again, pressure, should you deal with Iran, how you deal with Iran. But again, in my view, I'm continuing to be optimistic that sooner or later, Iran issue will have to be resolved, could only be resolved through negotiation, and a resolution of the Iranian issue is a gateway to stability in the Middle East. It is something we need to understand. We are not going to resolve Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestinian issue, Syria, Lebanon, unless you deal with Iran, unless you engage Iran as a powerful partner in the Middle East, and it holds a lot of keys to stability or instability in the Middle East. Mm-hmm.
Watch more great videos on Enigma TV's YouTube channel or log on to our website www.enigma-mag.com.